Gnaeus Pompeius Strabo, Consul 89 BCE. Pompeius Strabo is best known as the father of Pompey the Great, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, but he was probably the most important figure in the civil war between Marius and Sulla, which essentially ran from 88 to 83 BCE. Strabo refers to the quality of Pompeius's eyes, which were either crossed or else characterized by a squint. Cicero records that Strabo was characterized by his cruelty and avarice. His purported lack of personal charm, according to Plutarch, combined with his shameless and lengthy political maneuvering between the two parties in the civil war between Marius and Sulla, combined with his squint, made him seem untrustworthy. Unlike many other figures such as Sulla and Crassus, there is no record of Strabo possessing any virtues outside of his obvious talent for command. For the sake of simplicity, I shall simply refer to him as Strabo in most instances. The name Strabo by itself generally denotes the famous Greek geographer whose work has survived, and most mentions that you'll find of the name Strabo in most literature, ancient or modern, would be referring to the Greek geographer and not to Pompeius Strabo. Pompeius Strabo was part of the rural nobility from the city of Picenum, and he was the first person in his family to gain membership in the Roman Senate. His uncle was the famous satirical poet Gaius Lucilius. Strabo had an older brother whose grandson, Sextus Pompeius, became consul in 35 BCE, at the same time that Strabo's grandson by the same name, who we'll talk about in due time, died in Sicily, and thereby ended Strabo's line. Strabo entered the Senate at a time when there was a strong anti-rural bias, and it may fairly be said that he represented a phase in the ongoing struggle of Rome's allies to gain recognition in the Senate, since eligibility only slowly spread to other Italian cities. Strabo's date of birth is unknown, as is the exact date when he was admitted to the Senate. Whatever the exact date of his entry into the Senate, Strabo's career was predicated upon his military skill. Given that new men generally came in a little later in life than members of established families, Strabo was probably a bit older than most of the other senators approaching the consulship. This also seems to be implied by Plutarch's account of Strabo in his Life of Pompey. In 93 BCE, Strabo served as pro-praetor in Sicily, which means that he was praetor in Rome the year before. By this time, most of the praetors in Rome carried out judicial functions rather than serving as commanders of small armies. The social war broke out and raged between 91 and 88 BCE. This war was caused by the Roman Senate's long-standing refusal to extend Roman citizenship with all of its attendant legal protections to its Italian allies. Rome's Italian allies have been serving in the legions in greater numbers than the Romans themselves since at least the Second Punic War. The division between Roman citizens and their Italian allies had been the political fault line that Hannibal had attempted to exploit. Despite the 16 years that Hannibal had spent in Italy showing that point of weakness, Rome had done nothing to address the problem. The would-be reformer Laelius Sapiens and the Gracchi brothers, among others, had pointed out this problem and made attempts to address it, but to no avail. This was also linked to the land distribution problem, since Rome's extended frontier wars kept Roman and Italian farmer soldiers away from home for long periods of time. Without the family's primary laborer at home, the farm would become overgrown. Soldiers sent east could recoup some of their losses through plunder from rich areas. In Spain, however, where just as many or more soldiers were sent, the plunder was scarce. Many returning veterans had to sell their land to pay their bills and feed their families. The only people who could buy their land were aristocrats, whose power increased at the expense of the people. Worrisome even for Roman aristocrats was the fact that only landowners could serve in the legions, so Rome was having to draw from a steadily decreasing pool of men. The Gracchi brothers passed a land redistribution bill to deal with this problem, but after they were murdered, Roman aristocrats used it to take away some land from Italian aristocrats to give to poor Romans, while themselves sacrificing nothing and also giving nothing to dispossessed Italian farmers. Marius's reforms solved the manpower problem by making the legions more professional and not based on land ownership. But those reforms did not end the social, political, and economic injustices that Rome inflicted on all of its Italian subjects. The social war was long, brutal, and impossible to win outright because the Italians had the same arms and training as the Romans. The Romans were at a slight manpower disadvantage, but had the edge in terms of commanders. Marius was old and languid, but he conducted himself well and had some successes. Sulla was far and away the most successful general and impressed his fellow senators so much that they gave him charge of the war on Mithridates in the east. Strabo also rose to fame during this war and even earned himself a consulship in 89 due to his excellent battlefield performances. Unfortunately, there aren't very detailed accounts of these battles, but perhaps it is inevitable that Romans would not want to remember these frustrating and unnecessary battles that they could have and should have been able to avoid. The year 90 saw a number of early Italian victories, with the Romans rallying later in the year. Strabo commanded the Roman army at Asculum during his year as consul in 89, presiding over a major victory over an Italian army of 60,000, which decisively gave the Romans the edge in the war. In 88 BCE, Rome decided to offer full citizenship to all of Italy, which induced most of their wayward allies to return to the fold. Some further military action was necessary against the Samnites, but this was hardly a large or substantial campaign. That same year, Sulla was chosen to go to the east to deal with Mithridates. He was probably chosen over Strabo because Strabo was not a patrician and lacked Sulla's devilish charm. Strabo does not seem to have been angry at the lack of recognition his victory garnered, so he retired with his legionaries to Picenum. This practice of settling troops loyal to him nearby was repeated with great success by Sulla, his own son Pompey the Great, Caesar, and Augustus. Strabo, so far as I know, was the first person to do this. Marius was also hoping for that command in the east despite his old age and ever-increasing weight. Marius's indignation led him to have the Senate reverse their command decision, which proved to be a fatal mistake as Sulla, who was now the most popular man in Rome, convinced his soldiers to march with him to Rome and forced the Senate to reconfirm his command. Interestingly enough, all of Sulla's officers deserted him, which shows the dissensions in Rome at the time and the possibilities present for a strong leader. When Sulla eventually did go east, his famous proscriptions date to his second march on Rome, Marius returned from hiding and took power along with the politician Cinna. Strabo in Picenum, with his settled soldiers, was in a unique position, and that he was the only other commander to have a big enough following to be able to negotiate between the two warring parties. Due to his personality defects, this made him distrusted and disliked by almost all Romans. In 87 BCE, Sulla's party, which now called themselves the Optimates, the best men, approached Strabo successfully and got him to agree to side with them against the Marians. Strabo drew up his forces, and when he was in camp one night during a storm, he was struck down by lightning. Upon his death, Plutarch says that Strabo's body was saved only from desecration because of a tearful intervention by his then 23-year-old son, Pompey the Great. Plutarch virtually begins his life of Pompey the Great with this anecdote to show the contrast in personality between Strabo and his son. In 83 BCE, Strabo's old veterans were willing to follow Pompey the Younger when he rose up in support of the returning Sulla. This gave Pompey the leverage to negotiate for power with Sulla, serving as a proconsul without having held a single office at the time. And this is at a time when Sulla was regularizing the holding of offices in the Cursus Honorum and setting the minimum age of a consul at 42. Pompey's greatness was due in part to his charming good looks, but he owes his initial military support and his military talent to his father. Unlike Strabo, however, Pompey was not nearly as skilled at sneaky political maneuvers.